Hello and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be talking about commonly held beliefs that have been generated by feminism but that aren't actually true. This is part of a series I'm working on about dismantling the lies of feminism. Today I'll be focusing on the narrative that women are currently being victimized by patriarchy and why that isn't the case. Every wave of feminism has existed on the precedent that there is a substantial power imbalance between men and women. When women believe that there is a power imbalance and that all women are being systematically oppressed by a patriarchy that is thousands of years old, this puts them at odds with men. They believe on some level that men are villains. According to the modern feminist narrative, if it weren't for men, women would be happier. They would have more freedom. They could reach their full and unique potential as human beings. What stands between women and their self-actualization is the presence of men. If this is all true, then men must be inherently evil, and the only solution is to make men behave and think more like women. The way to do this is to demonize masculinity itself. It's okay to treat men badly because they oppress us. It's okay to cheat on them because they're all sexual deviants. It's okay to treat them like objects because they have treated us like objects. It's okay to disregard their feelings because they don't even have feelings. They're disposable and superfluous. Just wait until we invent artificial wombs. Then they can be harvested for their seed, and we don't even have to look at them. This is the attitude of feminism. In a previous video, I talked about how my feminist beliefs started to get me into trouble after I became married because I had embraced the ideology so much that it was influencing my thought patterns and my behavior. My husband and I used to have a very difficult marriage that nearly ended in divorce. One of the contributing factors of this was my tendency to blame my husband for things that were not his fault. In fact, the things I was blaming my husband for were actually my fault. One day I came to the realization that the bad things that were happening in my life were due to decisions I had made. Maybe I didn't make these decisions knowing that they would result in undesirable outcomes, but I made them all the same, and therefore I couldn't put the blame on someone else. For the most part, I believe that people make choices that contribute to the bad outcomes in their lives. This means that people are at least somewhat responsible for their bad situations in most cases. Obviously, there are always outside contributing factors such as society, and good people do find themselves in unfortunate circumstances. If someone's house gets hit by a tornado, that would be something that is outside of their control. When I started internally processing the belief that my decisions were responsible for the bad things in my life, I also realized that ultimately I was in control. I reasoned that if my choices led me to a bad situation, then couldn't my choices get me out of that situation? I found that taking accountability for my behavior, though it may be painful and shame-inducing at first, is actually liberating because that means I have a lot more control over my life than I previously thought. The belief that women in our society are being oppressed by a patriarchy has become widespread. It's become immersed into the mentality of both men and women that men are the perpetrators and women are the victims, which has led to many women having a victim mentality, which causes them to deflect blame onto other people. Deflection is a defense mechanism to shift the focus onto something or someone else to avoid the negative feelings associated with guilt. Feminism reinforces this type of thinking. There is a status connected to victimhood, and women seem to gravitate towards that status in order to receive sympathy and pandering. But in truth, nobody actually wants to be a victim, because a victim is someone who has been violated in a serious way through no fault of their own. It's the person standing in their yard looking at the remnants of their home which has been destroyed by a storm. Nobody is truly envious of actual victims because nobody wants to suffer. Where does the idea come from that women are perpetual victims? How has this been baked into the context of every conversation concerning women's role in society? Most importantly, what effect has this had on the mentality of women who are being systematically indoctrinated into a female-focused culture that openly reinforces the concepts behind the women's rights movement? Now I'm going to talk about the origins of victim mentality. Radical feminism describes women's current existence as it relates to patriarchy. According to radical feminists, society is fundamentally a patriarchy and has always been one. Radical feminists maintain that sexism, at its roots, comes from patriarchy and the systemic oppression, subordination, and abuse of women by the men who run the world. They believe that sexism is so embedded in our institutions, ethics, social norms, and standards that only dramatic changes can put an end to it. Radical feminism is an offshoot of the second-wave feminism movement of the 1960s and focuses primarily on sexual objectification, violence against women, gender roles, capitalism, ending male privilege, and ending sex distinctions. These feminists believed that genitalia or secondary sex characteristics should not matter, yet they also believe that women's role in reproduction should be accommodated. They have proposed the idea that women who are homemakers and stay-at-home mothers should be compensated for the work they do. While this idea seems extreme and completely unfeasible, I will say if parenting became a paid occupation, maybe more people would do a better job of it. Radical feminists describe the plight of women in terms of liberation, as in, women must be liberated from their current situation. They believe that the way women are living in developed Western nations such as the U.S. is akin to imprisonment. However, men's rights activists and those who subscribe to the red pill are asking the question, what more can men give to women that they don't already have that would set them free from this state of bondage? What would make women no longer victims? As far as I can tell, radical feminists would prefer it if women were no longer the sex that gets pregnant and gives birth, because it's unfair that men don't have to. But even if this were possible, it seems like it still wouldn't be enough. While many of the beliefs held by radical feminism are still considered extreme, aspects of all forms of feminism have made their way into mainstream culture through various forms of indoctrination, including the belief that women are and have always been victims of patriarchy. Under the Duluth model of feminism, women and children are considered to be perpetually vulnerable to abuse by men because the patriarchy teaches men that they are entitled to abuse their female intimate partners. However, there is conflicting research on how often men experience domestic abuse by women. Sources claim between 1 in 7 and 1 in 4 men are abused by women at some point in their lives. According to the website associated with the Duluth model, when men abuse women, it's because the patriarchy has ingrained in them the belief that it's their right to do so. But when a woman abuses a man, it's because she has a good reason. Usually it's a reaction to being abused by that man. They say that essentially it's out of self-defense, which takes the blame off of women. Men are always the natural perpetrators according to this branch of feminism, and the abuse inflicted upon men by women is trivialized. Under the Duluth model, feminism teaches women that they are weak and powerless against men, and all men are driven to hurt them. This is the fundamental principle behind the man versus bear question. Because men are so inherently malevolent and because women can't defend themselves against them, a woman is better off running into a bear than a man in the woods. Whatever that man intends to do with her is going to be 10 times worse than her being mauled to death or eaten alive by a bear. But nobody says to women that it's probably not a smart idea to be walking alone in the woods to begin with. This is because questioning women's decision-making processes or their freedom to do anything they please is not permitted. Rollo Tomassi, author of the book The Rational Male, says that we live in a gynocentric social order. He believes that feminism is a female supremacy movement that is motivated by vengeance and pushes for the female experience to be more valid than the male's. He believes that we are all indoctrinated into gynocentrism via education and all forms of media. Tomasi defines gynocentrism as a system in which the interests of women or feminism are exclusively prioritized, and he describes it as a form of worship. It's about giving women advantages that are not available to men. It's concerned with making men unnecessary to the function of society. Male disposability, which has been a part of the human condition for eons, is disregarded and ignored by feminists, despite feminism claiming to promote equality between the sexes. If feminists truly cared about equality, then they would work for changes to make men and women equally expendable. Now I'm going to talk about pop culture and mainstream media. Despite the amount of change that has taken place in the last 100 years, feminists continue to argue that our culture prioritizes the male experience over the female experience, or that the male perspective is more legitimate than the female's. In 1975, a woman named Laura Mulvey coined the term the male gaze to describe how women are portrayed in the media. This is the idea that women are depicted as sexual objects instead of people. In 1985, a female cartoonist invented the Bechdel test, which applies specifically to movies. The criteria of the Bechdel test are: number 1, does a movie have more than one woman in it? Number 2, do they talk to each other? And number 3, do they talk about anything other than a man? If these 3 things occur, then the movie passes the test. In 1950, which is considered to be an era of heightened female oppression according to feminism, a movie came out called All About Eve. This movie stars Bette Davis and Anne Baxter. Even Marilyn Monroe makes an appearance. This is the only movie in the history of the Oscars to receive 4 female actress nominations. The film's director, Joseph Mankiewicz, had an appreciation for women that he clearly demonstrated in his films, many of which propelled the most famous actresses into stardom. I've seen All About Eve twice, and I noticed that the women were not written as masculine. The actresses didn't consume the roles that would otherwise be played by men. Instead, their roles encapsulated a spectrum of feminine emotions and qualities. It certainly passes the Bechdel test and acknowledges that groups of women have their own dynamics, which are different from those of men. In recent decades, feminism has used pop culture in all forms of media to indoctrinate people into its faulty ideology. This becomes apparent when examining TV shows, YouTube videos, commercials, and movies, especially ones starring female leads. In contemporary entertainment, we often see female characters having way more strength, agility, and skills than they could ever have in real life because they're playing masculine roles. This makes it difficult for audiences to suspend their disbelief while watching because it's completely unrealistic. A character's human nature and vulnerability is a big part of what makes a character likable. The audience must be able to identify with the protagonist in order for them to actually care what happens to the character. However, film and TV makers seem to think that having a strong masculine female lead represents the modern feminine perspective, which makes it necessary to have those roles. It's difficult to relate to a character that can only exist in fantasy and has no weaknesses. It's almost as if this new trope of the invincible woman was created as an overcorrection to reverse female victimhood. It plays into this feminist fantasy of being a woman who can single-handedly injure men with her bare hands as revenge for men being physically stronger than women. As we see in the Duluth model, whenever a male character strikes a woman in movies and TV, that man is automatically the villain. However, we frequently see female characters beating the crap out of men with impunity. The female lead character in several newer movies and TV series is written as basically a man inside of a woman's body. The main character from the most recent Star Wars movies is a perfect example. The character Rey seldomly spoke. Despite never receiving any training and being substantially smaller than Kylo Ren, she was an indomitable match for him. She seemed not to care about any relationships with her father or otherwise. She had perfect timing and prowess. She could pilot spacecrafts and operate machinery flawlessly from her years of being a scrapper on her deserted home planet. Rollo Tomasi says in one of his YouTube videos that the reason this character is perfect and requires no training is because a man must become, while a woman just is. This means that men have the burden of performance and women don't, because women are valuable already, but a man must prove himself first. I personally thought this character was so impossible that I couldn't take the movie seriously. Real women care deeply about relationships. They tend to be more people-oriented than thing-oriented. Real women have flaws. However, Ray's character was robotic, cold, and unfeeling. She lacked the warmth and nurturing characteristics of the female characters of the past. There are other ways in which the ideas of feminism are being injected into TV and movies. One of the most obvious examples is the Barbie movie. Until recently, I had never seen the Barbie movie because I'm an adult, but after reading articles which either praised it for its message or criticized it for not being feminist enough, I decided to watch it and find out for myself. As unpleasant as this experience was, I felt like it was important for me to formulate my own judgment. Barbie Land is highly gynocentric because it revolves completely around the experience of the Barbies. The Kens are useless and hold no power. The beginning of the movie depicts a society filled with women without any responsibilities and who wish to party all the time. To me, this represents a state of permanent maidenhood, or the exaltation of the immature feminine, which reflects the overarching narrative of actual women in our society. The second half of the movie depicts a warped version of patriarchy, in which the Kens are idiots who force the Barbies to be naively subservient, inferring that patriarchy encompasses this idea of female subjugation and denigration. All the Kens have power just for being men. However, in actual patriarchy, a few men have power over other men based on a meritocracy, but their authority is balanced with responsibility. Moving on to the role of universities. Entertainment isn't the only area that has been infiltrated with feminist ideology. The institutions of higher education, which exert a lot of systemic influence, are known to host faculty members who are motivated to turn their students towards the feminist agenda because they are also activists. Universities are openly generative of feminist ideologies. According to Pew Research, 70% of women with a bachelor's degree or above consider themselves to be feminists. Between the numerous women's studies and gender studies courses offered at every major university, female students frequently organize to conduct protests over various issues. The purpose of these protests is to bring awareness to women's oppression by men and the patriarchy without acknowledging all of the rights that have been given to women over the past 100 years. In 1970, a man named Warren Farrell was elected to the board of directors on the National Organization for Women in New York City. This is one of the most prolific and well-known feminist organizations in the U.S. During his time with the organization, he traveled all across the U.S. speaking on college campuses and organizing groups of men and women in the name of feminism. Over time, Farrell began to notice that the focus of the feminist movement was shifting from granting women rights and opportunities to demonizing men. Shortly after writing his book, The Boy Crisis, in which he describes the severity of the problems boys are now facing, there was an incident at the University of Toronto in 2012. He was invited to a speaking engagement on campus and was met with a group of feminist protesters who ripped down his posters and blockaded the entrances. Toronto police were called out to dissolve the angry mob. I will include a link in the description below of video footage that was taken that night at the protest if you'd like to watch how intolerant and hateful the protesters were. Efforts on a federal level have been made to even the playing field for women in education beginning in the 1970s. Under Title IX, which was passed in 1972, it's now illegal for any educational programs that receive federal financial assistance to discriminate against women in any way. Despite 64% of all college students being female, feminists still proclaim discrimination in the college admission process. Regardless of the absence of female exclusion in any field in the United States, fourth-wave feminism roars on, claiming that women are still second-class citizens who suffer constantly from the oppression of men. Men's rights activists and those representing red pill ideology point out that there are no rights that men have that women don't have, and in fact, an argument could be made that women actually have more rights than men. For instance, women have the right to end a pregnancy and men do not. Even though 13 states have banned abortion after the overturning of Roe v. Wade, the Justice Department has filed a statement of interest prohibiting states from preventing women from traveling to another state to get an abortion. Additionally, women are legally privileged in divorce and family courts when it comes to child custody and the splitting of assets. Some feminists, however, argue that we don't have equal rights with men because the Equal Rights Amendment never officially passed. The Equal Rights Amendment, or ERA, was proposed in 1923. In 1972, it originally passed in Congress, but it wasn't ratified to the Constitution because it didn't receive the necessary support from state legislatures. The purpose of the ERA was to end legal distinctions between men and women in matters of divorce, property, and employment. In the 1970s, its opponents argued that this could theoretically lead to women being required to enroll in selective service, just like men have to. It was also opposed by women who didn't want to amend any of the laws surrounding divorce because it was clear that women receive a substantial advantage. The same feminist activists who marched and protested for equal rights between men and women raised no dissent when it came to the inequality of the issues in which women clearly benefit. Find me a feminist who is angry that women are exempt from military draft. Now I'm going to address the gender pay gap. Every year, the National Committee on Pay Equity, or the NCPE, promotes Equal Pay Day in order to bring awareness to the gender pay gap between men and women. This organization published a statistic that says women who work side by side with men, doing the exact same job, working the same number of hours with the same level of education, make 20% less than their male counterparts. This statistic is highly publicized by feminists and probably sounds familiar. However, there is no awareness surrounding the disparity in occupational fatalities between men and women every year. In 2019, the Bureau of Labor Statistics published data that reported around 92% of occupational deaths in 2018 were men, and only 8% were women. The NCPE fails to report data pertaining to the number of men and women entering occupations which pose a higher number of workplace risks. Men overwhelmingly represent the jobs which involve higher risks and therefore higher pay, such as iron and steel workers, roofers, construction workers, electricians, and the power systems engineers who maintain power lines. Women far outnumber men in comfortable, low-risk jobs such as office and administrative support, education, library, and healthcare workers. Despite these pronounced differences, the statistic that the average woman earns 80 cents per every dollar a man earns implies that the only factor involved to explain this discrepancy is the presence of gender discrimination. But this just isn't true. Furthermore, this statistic does not take into account that along with female-dominated occupations paying less in general, that pregnancy and the birth of children has a sizable effect on a woman's yearly income due to the necessity of maternity leave. Researchers in the Netherlands found that there is a substantial wage penalty during the first year of life. Each child a woman has causes a temporary career interruption, which over time results in a 5 to 7% wage penalty per child. This data, along with the gender segregation in careers, explains why women make less than men in general. However, it's not because they are being victimized by a patriarchal system. In conclusion, whenever a woman has a problem, there's a cultural perception that it's a man's fault. But whenever a man has a problem, it's his fault. In reality, the source of most problems come from a combination of things that are both within and beyond an individual's control. When women believe that their problems are not their fault, it becomes easy for them to blame other people, especially men. What this does is send a message to women that because their problems are not actually their fault, then there's no reason to be held accountable for their actions. This feeds into a cycle of poor choices, deflection, and blame that causes women to stay in a mode of immaturity throughout their adult lives and results in an uneven distribution of responsibility between men and women. Even when you have problems that are truly caused by other people, oftentimes the correct response is to hold yourself accountable anyway, because analyzing and changing your behavior is frequently the only way to fix those problems. You can't force anyone else to do anything for you or to atone for whatever they've done. Therefore, it's up to you to either cut that person out of your life or take measures to overcome your situation. All forms of self-help, whether it's cognitive behavioral therapy, pseudoscientific New Age methods, or even religion, teaches people that in order to make their lives better, they have to stop focusing on other people and outside forces and instead look inside themselves. I use the Serenity Prayer as a gentle reminder that understanding what is within my control and what is not determines where I should direct my focus. Hyperfixating on things you can't control will make you powerless and unable to change your life. I think the goal of feminism is to impose a power dynamic that forces an unnatural social order that does not reflect our design. Men are stronger than women, but that doesn't mean they exist to mistreat women. It's true that a small minority of men can be violent, but they are far outnumbered by the men who are driven to protect women. The majority of men are not cruel, vicious monsters. I think a lot of people underestimate the power of beliefs. The beliefs you hold about yourself have the potential to propel you towards accomplishing your goals or to destroy your life through self-fulfilling prophecies of inadequacy. Believing that you're capable of achieving what you want and seeing failures as teachable setbacks is half of any battle. When a person, male or female, believes that they are disadvantaged and held back by the institutions that run our country, he or she will manifest a reality in which they are the victim because they are condemned to that identity. So thank you for watching and listening. If you have any thoughts you'd like to share, you're welcome to leave me a comment. If you have any book suggestions or any topics you'd like me to talk about, go ahead and leave me a comment down below for that. You'll find my sources in the description if you'd like to take a look at those. So once again, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.